and I'm not allowed to do that. So anyway, Fran.
Part of the new life. Okay. Dr. Jean Wyrick is an emeritus professor from Colorado State University. She's worked there for 25 years before she sort of retired, not really. She taught American Studies and Women's Studies, which I hope continues.
Yeah.
She began collecting suffrage memorabilia almost 50 years ago. She has the largest, most notable collection in Colorado. It is really incredible. Take time afterward to look at it. She's frequently called upon to talk about the suffrage movement in Fort Collins, in other places in Colorado. And she's active, not a surprise, in social reform movements that are relevant to this. The League, the National Organization of Women Now, others, etc. This is about as timely as it gets. You all realize that. So gain some hope for this and gain some courage. In a time of panic, we need action.
Absolutely. Thank you, Fran. All right, welcome everybody. Like I say, I'm Jean, and I'm going to talk to you for a little while, and then we'll have questions and comments and so forth afterwards, if you don't mind. So thank you to the Larimer League of Women Voters who invited me to the Larimer League of Women Voters South discussion group. Fran, a shout out to Northern Colorado chapter of NOW for their support. For all the tech people and the library people, there are more details and chores that go on to putting on something like this than you can imagine. And thank you all for coming out. And those of you who are watching on Zoom, we hope. All right. And a special thanks to Kathy for coming and helping. All right. Welcome to Women's History Month. So, all right. Okay. As most of you know, the women's history movement formally began in 1848 with the first convention in Seneca Falls. I'm not going to start back in 1848, or you would be here till midnight and the library would be definitely closed. But I am doing a shout out in the way I am dressed, not the way that the suffrage parades that I'm going to talk about were dressed, but to Susan B. Anthony, because the 19th Amendment that the women were working for in her honor is called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And it's a misconception to think that she was there for it. She sadly died in 1906. The amendment did not pass until 1920. She never got to see the fruits of her labor, but we honor her by calling it the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Well, all right, I'm going to set the stage. See me already, I want to be moving around here. We're going to set the stage because I'm going to start more or less 1910 or really 1913, the most active years. What's the country like at that time? Women were regulated to what they call women's sphere of influence. Women were supposed to run the households, and that's where their influence was. Men ran the businesses, the politics, and so forth. It was supposed to be separate spheres of influence. Now, some states had given women the right to vote, but it was a huge mess. The 4 states that had given women by this time the right to vote were, and the first one, what was the first one? Wyoming. Trick question. Trick question. Which state was the first to give women the vote? Colorado. You all are so good. You are so good. All right. Wyoming was a territory, and the right to vote was passed in the legislature. The first state to actually have a popular referendum, meaning the men had to vote, the women the right to vote, was Colorado. Yay, us. All right. The other two were Utah and Idaho. Utah, if some of you are from there, you know, Utah was unique in that they gave women the right to vote, then they rescinded it, and then they gave it back all over a period of years. It had to do with polygamy and all sorts of other things. That's another story. But at any rate, across the country, women's suffrage was just a mess. And what do I mean by that? Besides the 4 states, in some places, even some towns, they would let women vote on, say, city council or school board, or you could vote maybe in a state election, but not national. It varied from place to place to place, depending on where you lived. There was no, come on in, there was no uniform except in those four states. Right? So that depending on where you were, your rights were very different. And it was very confusing because you could move and suddenly lose your rights or gain more rights or, you know, or whatever. So it was something needed to be done to make it more uniform. Well, at this time, they wanted the rest of the country to be like the 4 states. And that is one reason you all will notice that I'm wearing the suffrage colors, purple, white, and gold. The gold was for the 4 Western states. And you will see a lot of suffrage items. I don't know if I brought any actually, with suns on them. The setting Western sun are gold. They're over there. The badges that said, the buttons that said vote for women were gold because they wanted to make the whole country like the 4 Western states. Now, let me just take a detour and tell you, because I always get asked, why are some of the colors over here white, purple, and green? And that was the English, the British suffrage movement that was very active at the same time. We changed ours over here to gold to represent the 4 states, including Colorado. So, all right, who were the popular organizers at this time? Now that when Susan B. Anthony died in 1906, well, probably the strongest organizer was Carrie Chapman Catt. All right, and there's pictures of her over there, various places. All right, she was the leader, and she was in charge of the largest suffrage organization, which was called the National American Women's Suffrage Organization, a mouthful, NAWSA. And you will see I have some things marked NAWSA. This was the largest suffrage organization. She had what was called the winning plan. And her idea, again, was to go from state to state to try to get the states to match up with, and there's a postcard over there about the way the states, all the states ought to be, like the 4 states. All right, that was the idea, to do it state by state. That changed, but that was where it was when we're starting. She had a young woman working for her that I'm going to talk a lot about today too. And her name was Alice Paul. And there's pictures of Alice and various things around here. Alice Paul was a Quaker. She was 30 some odd years younger than Carrie Chapman Catt. And that will make a big difference when I get to some other things later, the difference in their age. They were from totally different decades of experience. All right, Alice Paul and several of her colleagues, young women, had gone to England because the English suffrage movement going on at the same time was huge. It was also much more militaristic and violent. Civil disobedience was the key in England. The women's, there's even a book called Ladies, Please Don't Break Those Windows. They broke windows, they poured ink into postal boxes, they set fires. They didn't murder people, but they did civil disobedience was the way to go. Well, Alice Paul worked for them, and these were the Pankhursts, Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, if you know those names. If you ever go to England and you go to Parliament, there's a statue of Emmeline Pankhurst outside of Parliament. So just heads up there. All right. So Alice Paul trained under a very different approach. And this is important because Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt had a difference of opinion about tactics and what to do. Now, Alice Paul, oh, and by the way, while I was talking about England, I'm always asked, why during this presentation do I keep saying suffrage and not suffragette? And let me just get that out of the way. Suffragette was a term that was applied to the women in England, and it was applied as an insult, that you were a little you were a little, just little nondescript, nothing here. And in fact, at some point you can look, there's kitty cats over here, over there, and that was something else from England. But the suffrage people in England, the women, took it over as a badge of honor, and they became the suffragettes, and they adopted the cat. And you'll see the cats over here that say, I want my vote. Over here, however, the women for the vote preferred the term suffragists, or they were known, nickname was suffs, all right? And then there were the anti-suffs, all right? So that's what you will hear me say during this talk. All right, now I'm going to leap forward, and you all must forgive me because I'm going to be painting with a broad brush to get through before the library closes. All right, I'm going to jump to 1913. Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt were working together, but Alice Paul wanted things to move quicker. And I am not saying Carrie Chapman Catt was the consummate diplomat behind the scenes. She led so many conventions. She went to state legislature. She talked to people everywhere. She was tireless, but she was doing this, as a person, more or less a person-to-person, state-to-state movement. Alice Paul wanted to speed things up. Again, I think because she was 30 years younger. It was just maybe a different mindset here. Alice Paul, while she was still working, she wanted more money for publicity. She decided to hold the first big suffrage parade. And she held this parade on March 3rd, 1913. Why did she pick that? In Washington, D.C. Why did she pick that date? Because it was the day before Woodrow Wilson was to be inaugurated as president in Washington. Between 5,000 and 8,000 women showed up. Wilson came into town the way presidents did back then on the train. He expected to have this enormous crowd welcoming him on the day of his inauguration. They weren't there. And he said, "Where is everybody?" And they said, "They're over looking at the women." All right? Women, again, you've got to put yourself back in that time. Women stayed at home. They did not get out and march in the street. You really have to understand how unusual this was. All right. They got out in the street with their banners. They frequently, in all their parades, dressed in white. They often dressed as goddesses. They dressed as Joan of Arc. They dressed regal queens and so forth. And there are pictures scattered around. I have one section over here of postcards that says parades and things, and you can take a look at them. I'm sure you've seen the pictures here. And sometimes our own women in our legislature will don white outfits. And this is a throwback to them. All right, what happened? Well, the women were spat on, they were catcalled, they had rocks thrown at them, and they were beaten. Their banners were confiscated and torn up, and at least 100 that we know of went to the hospital. All right. My favorite catcall story is the men, and these were men because that's who lined up to see, and the police did nothing. They were instructed not to do anything. They did not. My favorite story, one of them, the men would yell, "Go home to your mothers. Go home to your mothers." And my favorite story is that one of the young women went, "My mother's right here." Because this has been going on for years and years. All right. Fast forward the next couple of years, again, Alice Paul arranging parades, all kinds of demonstrations. Carrie Chapman Catt is working state to state to try to do these things. Well, they fell out finally. Carrie Chapman Catt took her entourage and left, split off from NAWSA, and started her own group, the National Woman's Party. Okay, so you had these two competing parties, same goal, of course, different tactics. And also Alice Paul was convinced that we needed a national amendment and that going state to state was just too slow and just might not work. And Catt came around to that eventually. All right. So, again, coming up, 1916, Wilson is coming up for re-election. His slogan, as many of you might know, was, "He kept us out of war," because World War I had already started in Europe, and we were isolationists. So Wilson's, platform was, "He kept us out of war." Well, Alice Paul's group's retort was, "He kept us out of the voting booth." All right. She believed in holding whichever party was in power responsible. We got into the war, as you know. Wilson asked Carrie Chapman Catt, asked that her group back off and work for the war effort, to not make the country look divided and fussing with itself. Alice Paul said, "No way." All right. So again, you can see same goals, but very, very, very different tactics here. There were trains that went all over the country called the suffrage specials trains. And by the way, Susan B. Anthony came to Colorado. I don't know if you know that. Came to Colorado Springs. Didn't come up here, but to Colorado Springs. All right. There were all of these behind the scenes negotiations going on. They would meet with Wilson to try to get him to throw his influence to the voting. And first he said, "I don't have an opinion about it." And then his position was, "It's a state issue. We're going to throw this back and stick. He didn't want to touch this, at all. So throw it back to the States. All right, more and more demonstrations. Again, after I'm finished talking, you might want to look at some of the stuff. This is just some of the stuff I brought, because it might have more meaning for you. Somewhere, I think over here, there's some pictures of Inez Mulholland Wasserdain, who is our American suffragist martyr. Inez Mulholland Wasserdain was an early lawyer. She was very, very active here. She was frequently dressed in white and on her white horse. I have a tote bag over here with her motto was forward out of darkness, forward into light. And she would lead on this big white horse and, Joan of Arc like here. And she campaigned so hard all over the country that she was in the midst of a speech and she died. And she was a young woman. She had pernicious anemia. She may have had pneumonia just from being out in the elements, because they often spoke outside. And the last words on her lips were, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And she died. And so you will often see pictures of her because she is regarded as our American martyr. There's a British woman who was a martyr too, but that's another whole story. All right. By April 1917, we have entered the war. We are no longer neutral.
Recording in progress.
Am I? Okay. Okay. All right. I was going to read you how many conventions Carrie Chapman Catt did, but it's a long list, and I can give you that information later. Well, at any rate, Wilson's slogan by this time was, "He's making the world safe for democracy," right? This was, after we entered the war. Well, the suffragists, mostly Alice Paul's group, wanted to point out to him that while he was making the world safe for democracy, half the people in this country could not vote. They were often taxed. Taxation without representation was a big slogan of the suffragists. Just, hearkening back to our American Revolution, you could be taxed, but you were not represented in Congress. Because women had no say in who was elected to Congress, they had no say about the war effort. They were said, "We send our sons to war. We have no say in any of this." So you can see the anger there, I hope, of feeling like we're fighting for Europe, but not fighting for the rights of women here. Carrie Chapman Catt's group were not silent, and I've got over here, a Women's Citizen, which is a publication, and they did a lot of war efforts. Am I okay?
Someone on Zoom is stuck on mute.
Oh, they're not on mute. Okay. Tune in. Okay. They did a lot of bandage rolling. They did a lot of work with the wounded and so forth, because again, this a little bit of a difference in what the activities and the approaches should be. Well, Alice Paul's group, meanwhile, decided to be as active as possible. So they started this group called the Silent Sentinels. Perhaps you've heard of them. They're pictures. I don't know where my pictures wound up, but anyway, women from the National Women's Party, Paul's party, started picketing the White House. Now, I'm going to say that again because do you realize that before they did this, no group had ever picketed the White House. It just wasn't done. Now, again, this was not Victorian age, but it came out. But this was just not considered, a polite, nice thing to do. It just wasn't done. The women showed up. It was cold. It was in the winter. They showed up with their banners, with their signs, and they paraded up and down in front of the main White House gates. This was scandalous. It was also designed to embarrass Wilson, who still wouldn't come on board. Because during this war, there were dignitaries from Europe coming to the White House, coming through the White House gates. They held up signs that, again, said things like, 50% of this, make the world safe for democracy, except here, all right? They said, taxation without representation. They said, when are you going to do something, for us? They even had one of their big signs, they even called him Kaiser Wilson, all this stuff. Ooh, this was really, yeah, this was really embarrassing. Oh, is it? Okay, I thought it was coming in. This was very, very embarrassing to Wilson and to the anti-suffrage people. So, and these women were also attacked on a daily basis. They were attacked by bystanders. They were sometimes attacked by the local police, right? And then they would just be replaced the next day. So Wilson, through his minions, ordered that they would be arrested, right? Now, I give you an example of a woman. Helena Hill Weed was arrested and jailed for 3 days for carrying a banner, and I have to read this, that said, governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Do you know where that came from? Declaration of Independence. She got 3 days for carrying that sign. All right. Well, they continued to arrest the women because it was just too embarrassing. So they had to come up with some reason to arrest the women. Do you know what their high crime and misdemeanor was? Obstructing the sidewalk. All right. And they would be arrested. And at first they got 3 days, like Helena here. Well, the women just got out and went right back. All right. They were undeterred, or people took their place. It was over and over again. That was not having much of an impact. And I have to tell you that not everybody was in favor of this. Carrie Chapman Catt said that she thought this was vulgar. And again, I go back to that kind of difference in rearing, in upbringing, and so forth. All right. Things got more and more heated. At one point, they had 3 days of rioting in front of the White House, and people were arrested. And they started giving them longer jail sentences because they said 3 days was not working. They started giving them 60-day jail sentences for obstructing the sidewalk. Well, here's where things get dark, all right? The women frequently, because it was DC, many of the women were sentenced to the Occoquan Workhouse in Lorton, Virginia, right? Which, by the way, you can visit now if you're ever in Northern Virginia. It's an art space now, and there's a little museum, but more about that later. Well, anyway, they were taken to this workhouse. The women insisted that they were political prisoners, and they refused to work because they were told they had to mop the floors and do all this work. And they said, we're political prisoners, we're not going to do that. Well, the women were very mistreated. They were not allowed visitors. They were not allowed letters. And some were put on bread and water. All right. Now, if you want, I'm going to read you an excerpt or two, but if you really want a wonderful description of what that was like, I recommend this little book called Jailed for Freedom, written by a woman who was there this is back in the 20s. It's been edited down to a very small volume, so it's very accessible, but it will just shock you. And so I'll put that out there. All right, I'm going to read you a short excerpt from a woman named Virginia Bovee, who was not a suffragist, but she was a prison matron. So not on their side, okay? And this is from her affidavit. Quote, I am well acquainted with the conditions at Occoquan. I have had charge of all the suffrage prisoners who have been there. I know that their mail has been withheld from them. The blankets now being used in the prison have been in use since December without being washed or cleaned. And she goes on. The beans, hominy, rice, cornmeals, and cereal they were fed have all got worms in them. Sometimes the worms float on the top of the soup. Often they are found in the cornbread. The first suffragists sent the worms to Warden Whittaker on a spoon. All right. Prisoners are punished by being put on bread and water or by being beaten. I know one girl who's been kept on 17 days, on bread and water. And it goes on. This was Doris Stevenson. And again, all of this is true. Okay. So more and more women are being arrested and given these 60-day terms. They are being beaten in the prisons and the workhouse by the guard, by these notorious wardens. This one in particular was particularly terrible. And the violence, I guess you would say, sort of culminated in what is known as the Night of Terror. And this is November 1917, when 100 or more women had been sent to the Occoquan workhouse. And the women were not allowed to get messages in and out, but they often smuggled little pieces of paper, out with sympathetic matrons and so forth. And so that's how we know certain things were happening at that particular time. Lucy Burns, who went to England with Alice Paul. Lucy Burns was a very attractive young woman, red hair, Irish, really a go-getter. She was arrested more times than any suffragist in this country. And she wrote on little scraps of paper that were smuggled out. And she wrote about a hunger strike that the suffragists had gone on because of the conditions, because they were being beaten, because they were not being fed adequately, because they were being held without any communication of their situation. And she wrote, and again, I'm just quoting just a little teeny part. They went on a hunger strike. And the warden could not have that, because if they died, that would be really embarrassing. So they began to force feed the women in the workhouse by shoving tubes down their noses to their stomachs and putting raw eggs into them. Lucy Burns wrote, and I'm just going to quote a tiny little bit. I was held down by 5 people at arms, legs, and head. I refused to open mouth. Gannon, he's another one of the wardens, pushed tubes up my left nostril. It made me, my nose bleed freely. It said operation makes one very sick. And after this, I was brought into the hospital in an ambulance. Now, I don't know about you all, but I never heard about this in school growing up. You know, I was never taught about this. Another one of the women, whose name was Dora Lewis, I was seized and laid on my back, where 5 people held me, including one leaping on my knees, which seemed to break under the weight. They forced the tube. I was gasping and suffocating with the agony of it. I didn't know how to breathe, you know, so forth and so on. And this was a very, very common occurrence. Alice Paul, of course, was frequently beaten and arrested. And at one point, they put her in solitary confinement because they didn't want her with, you know, the other women. And they put her, they had to have, you know, something to claim. They put her in the psychiatric ward. And the evidence, of her mental illness was her obsession with Wilson. Well, indeed she was, you know. All right. Well, all of this came to a head on November 17th, the night of terror. The guards had had enough. They began beating the women. They pushed one elderly woman down the stairs. They threw one so hard against a metal container that she lost consciousness. One woman had a heart attack. They did not get her medical help. And Lucy Burns was such a rabble rouser, remember red-haired Lucy Burns, that to isolate her and keep her from encouraging her sisters, they handcuffed her and they strung her up over her head, over her head to iron bars. Now, I don't know about you all, but you try holding your arms up over your head. They left her that way all night. All right. Now, the story goes, I'm old, but I wasn't there. So I don't know if this story is true. I want it to be true. That when the other women in the cells who could see her strung up with her arms over her head, which we do know happened, that they all held their arms up as long as they could. And I do want that story to be true. So I'm going to tell it to you and tell you that it's true. All right. Well, this was bad. And word leaked out, little scraps of paper. Some of it got to, for example, the husband of one of the women who was incarcerated. And he happened to work in the Wilson administration. And so word got out. This was really bad publicity because, again, I mean, it's horrible enough for us, but you have to remember that women were you know, considered the better half and all of that back then. So the fact that women were being pushed downstairs and thrown against, you know, metal until they became unconscious and so forth, this was just really beyond the pale. All right, so this is why it's known as the night of terror. All right, I'm skipping ahead here. Well, Wilson had kind of had enough. You know, this was just getting to be too awful. The judges were saying, we can't get anything done. We've got 150 women every day in the courtroom. We don't have a place to put these women. We convict them, we send them out, and there's 150 more the next day. So the tide was beginning to turn. You understand, I'm painting with a broad brush here. This was not overnight, of course. All right. The amendment was introduced into Congress multiple times. It kept failing. It failed once by 11 votes. It failed once by 1 vote. All right, but finally, it passed in Congress. That's not the end of the story. All right, but I'm going to take a little detour here. The key question is, how do you get people in power to vote to let half again people into your power? Now think about South Africa or places like that. Have the vote. We only had a few states by then. We had a few more, but we were not in control of voting ourselves power. How do you get people to vote you power when you don't have any? And then a bigger question I'm always asked, and I'm going to come around to that, is was opposing women's suffrage. Well, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you about the biggest groups, because the anti-suffs had incredible amounts of money to fight this. Huge amounts of money. All right. Of course, you have people who simply didn't want to share power. Exactly. If I give you power, I have less myself. You know, that kind of argument. But who else? Well, and there were men and many, many women, the anti-suffs groups, who thought women's sphere of influence should stay at home, that politics were dirty, that women should, stay out of it, that they were the angels of the house, as Virginia Woolf complained about. I brought a full-page ad over here of very prominent women, including the past president of Wellesley College, a woman. No, we don't want the vote. All right. So there were those people. And I will invite, well, I'll get to that about the postcards, the anti-postcards. All right. There were people who felt that women would get into politics and become very masculine. They would abandon their home, their children, and that men would become emasculated by these women. And I just delight in bringing all the anti-postcards that you see over there, where the women are going out and the poor guy is home with the babies and a cat or something. If you haven't looked at these, they're over here, the anti-postcards. And I'll explain about postcards if I have time. Okay, all right. But where were they getting the big money? Political bosses in this country, as you know, political machines were very corrupt, and a lot of those politicians did not want women getting into politics because they thought we would clean it up. All right. And there's a pro card here, over here somewhere, that it says women will make politics more honorable. All right. Another group, huge amounts of money, the liquor industry. All right. Why? Particularly the beer industry, even one that you may be familiar with here in Colorado, donated huge amounts to anti-suffrage. Why? Many of the women in the suffrage movement came out of the abolition movement, but by this time they came out of the temperance. A lot of them came out of the temperance movement. Why? Because alcohol was the drug of choice and was directly tied to domestic abuse. All right? And the temperance unit were the temperance movement were not a bunch of fussy little old ladies. They were often women who were trying to protect other women and children by reducing the number of saloons, public drunkenness, domestic abuse. The liquor industry was scared to death that if women got in power or got some power, that they would work against free-for-all, free-flowing liquor. All right. Large industrial companies were often against. Why? Because they feared women would work against child labor laws. They would work against women being paid a pittance to work in garment, for example, the garment industry. Some of you may know about the shirtwaist fire here where women were locked in and perished in fire. So you had leaders of industry who were very opposed because, again, they thought women would come in and make a difference in child labor laws and women labor laws. You had, are you beginning to get the picture here? You had the southern states. All right. You know, the 14th and 15th Amendment gave Black men citizenship and the right to vote, but not Black women. But if we had a constitutional amendment giving all women the right to vote, that would double the number of Black voters in the South, men and women. So the southern states almost, unanimously were opposed. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Religious organizations, including the Catholic Church, were often big anti-suffs. And again, I won't go into that, but the role of women was maybe looked at differently from an equal partner. Enough said about that. And I did bring Margaret Sanger's book that she published, Agitating for Birth Control, so that women would not have, and that's from a little bit later in this time period, so women would not have 14 children or die in childbirth. So that, as she said, motherhood would be voluntary. And again, that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, all right, in the religious groups and so forth. Last, and then I'll stop because I think you're getting the notion. As you know, in Russia in 1917, there was the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks killed the Tsar and his family. The communists took over. And guess what they did? They gave women the right to vote. So, because everybody was going to be equal. Yeah. So some people oppose this as part of a communist plot, a Bolshevik plot to make us like Russia. Well, all right. On and on and on. Others can turn the page here. Okay. How do you overcome this? How do you get people to do this? Well, these women worked tirelessly. They mounted, because they frequently didn't have these big, donations of money, although there were a lot of benefactors. If you've ever been to the Belmont House in DC, Mrs. Belmont was a wealthy widow who gave Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Katz lots of money here. So, but the suffragists just worked at so many different ways of raising money, even to There's a postcard of them in these little roller carts down boardwalks. There were suffragist lunch counters. I brought a few things. There's suffragist playing cards. There's suffragist cookbooks over here. And I have 2 copies, so I brought one and opened it to Carrie Chapman's cat's egg recipe, in case you want it. There were shoe polish, soap, I mean, endorsements everywhere to raise money as much as they could. They appealed rationally and they appealed emotionally. And here's where I'm going to just take a little detour to why did she bring so many postcards? All right, well, because English professors are perverse, I guess. I don't know. But you have to realize that at the turn of the century back then, this was a rural country still. I mean, very much. People didn't have phones, like when they didn't have cell phones, but they didn't even have phones, Hello Central. But what they did have was the penny postcard. It was the social media of the day. All right, 1 penny. Because you remember, through rain and snow and, all of that and everything, you could be on a farm and mail a penny postcard with your postal service to somebody 4 farms over that said, meet me in town after church for dinner, right? This was a major communication, especially in rural areas where people didn't have phones. You didn't just, you couldn't just gallop over there to say, 1 or 2 things. So I became very interested in the rhetoric of pro and con postcards of this period. And there's the story there. But at any rate, and as you can see, some of the anti-ones I brought, emasculation is a big theme. The ugliness, and I mean physical ugliness of suffragists, man-haters, and all of this. Well, you had serious postcards. There's a series over here called the Cargill series that was put out by NAWSA that, says things like no taxation without representation and, appealing to people's reason and so forth. Although one I don't have, I'd love to have it, says, just because we get the vote, I'm paraphrasing, just because we get the vote doesn't mean we're going to take over the police to become police officers. Ha, and indeed we did. But anyway, what were some of the social media ones here? They played on a theme. It's primarily what I brought because I like them so much. Of trying to convince men, remember what I said, how do you convince people with power to vote for people without power, that they were not going to take over, that they were not going to punish them, that they were not going to do to them what had been done, to women for all this time. So they were very benign in that they wanted to say, oh, don't worry, we're not going to do bad things. There's one over there that says, come on over and be a good fellow, and vote for us. And so you have a lot of little girls, if you've noticed over there, little girls, little cupids, little cats, little, benign kinds of messages here that, that you should come over and vote with us. So I think the reason that I find these so amusing is because contrast, when you look at them again, contrast these little girls, these little Cupid dolls with their signs and everything to what was happening in the workhouse. All right. So again, that whole thing of how do you try to wheedle people to come over to your side there? Well, all right, I'm skipping ahead. Okay, It finally passed Congress, but that's not the end, because it had to be ratified by 3/4 of 48 states. That's a heck of a lot. All right. Well, the tide was turning. Wilson finally came on board. Won't go there. All right. Things were progressing for this national constitutional amendment. All right. Jumping ahead. It came down to it, folks. Mississippi was never going to ratify. The southern states, for reasons I explained to you, were not going to come on board. It came down to Tennessee, the last chance, a border state, all or nothing, one state. The Suffs and the anti-Suffs moved in on Tennessee like you have never seen. The shenanigans that went on with the state legislators who had to vote is just amazing. The next book I recommend, The Women's Hour. You have my absolute double money back if you can read this book with not being on the edge of your seat. You know how it's going to come out, but it is an amazing book about what happened in those weeks. And there are people who've read it here who would agree with me. What happened in those days leading up to the vote? The liquor industry wined and dined, the legislators, they took them out, they gave bribes. There were even legislators who tried to leave town because they were going to get caught up, having to vote one way or another. And maybe you've seen pictures. The anti-legislators wore red roses. The pro-suffrage legislators wore yellow roses. And that is why on Women's Equality Day, you will frequently see women with yellow roses. And again, it goes back to this, but that it also goes back to the red and yellow roses idea here. All right. It came down after these weeks of bribes and parties, and like I say, the shenanigans will just boggle your mind here that this book is so well researched and it's so readable. All right, it came down to the vote. This was it. It was going to be so close, but maybe not. And then it would be all for naught. One more state. They all came in wearing the roses. And what happened? The youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, a young chap named Harry T. Byrne, was going to vote no. Harry T. Burns got a message from his mother. I'm not making this up. Phoebe Byrne contacted her son and said, and I'm paraphrasing but close, be a good boy and make Mrs. Cat happy. And he switched his vote. And our 19th Amendment, because of Tennessee, because of Phoebe Byrne, passed by one vote. Women, we have the vote by one vote. Now, I will tell you why there are not statues to Phoebe Byrne all over this country. I don't know. I think there should be. I spent most of my life teaching, and sometimes I would have young people who could vote, were above 18, and they would say to me, my vote doesn't matter. One vote doesn't matter. I want each and every one of you here to leave, and the next person that says that to you, I want you to say, really? And if they're female, they ask them if they like to vote and tell them one vote made all the difference. Promise me that you will do that. All right. You all have been very patient. The amendment passed. It was signed into law on August 26, 1920. That is why August 26th is Women's Equality Day every year. It was signed into law, put into law, what they have to do in secret. Carrie Chapman Catt was not invited, Alice Paul was not invited, because the government was so afraid that there were going to be riots. They did try to overturn things in Tennessee, but it didn't work here. Maybe you have seen pictures, because I'm often asked about this, about Alice Paul sewing. I don't know if you see pictures. I may have brought one over there. And there's a picture of her with the flag, and she's holding it. It is not champagne. She was a teetotaler, but she's holding a glass of champagne. Every time a state, passed it and ratified it, she sewed a star on. And so there's some very famous pictures of her at the NWP building in DC, of her hanging this flag out the window with all the stars on it. And I think I brought a picture there. Well, all right. I want to clear up one misconception. I knew that was going to happen sooner or later. All right. Thank you. All right. Yeah, very flimsy. It wasn't not nailed together, but no, it's okay. It's all right. Yep. It's okay. We'll just hang out Alice Paul's. In there. All right. I want to clear up one misconception and then tell you what Chapman Catt went on to do. She was so confident that this was going to happen. She never lost faith. That months before the Tennessee vote, she took her party and it morphed into the League of Women Voters. Why? Because she was so confident, but she was worried that these women, particularly in rural America, did not know how to vote, didn't know anything about elections, didn't know, how to register. And so she morphed her party when it passed into the organization that will educate, protect, and has gone on for decades and decades and decades of great work. Yay! I encourage you to join. What did Alice Paul do? You might wonder. In 1923, she and a colleague, and this is a little known fact, they wrote the first version of the ERA. Wow. It has changed a little bit and introduced it, and it failed. And it failed again in the 70s. Hello, Southern states, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want to just end by clearing up one important misconception, because it just drives me crazy, particularly with young women today. The 19th Amendment gave all female citizens the right to vote. All female citizens, regardless of race, color, previous servitude, any of that. There were some exceptions. There were some Native American tribe women who were not granted yet full citizenship, so they were not included. There are some islands in the Pacific where women were not given the vote, because again, it was a citizenship matter. But there is a misconception that women of color, particularly Black women, were excluded from the 19th Amendment. This is untrue. It's complicated in that, yes, there was a time, to my regret, that the suffragists wondered if they should take a half a loaf instead of a whole. In other words, to get it through, should they appease the southern states and only make it white women who could vote? And to their credit, they did not. It says all can vote. Now, that was the amendment in theory. In practice, as we well know, that did not happen. The southern states immediately passed poll tax, literacy tests, ID tests, property ownership tests, KKK intimidation, so that we really did not have the full voting privileges for all women, particularly women of color, until the 60s and the Civil Rights Act. But I want to tell you, and also I had to cut out to make this shorter, you've been so patient, but the role of Black women in the suffrage movement is a really interesting talk too, which I will do some other time in some other place. But they were very active by people like Ida B. Wells that you may know and so forth. But it was a controversy. But I just want you to know that they rose to the occasion and said it's all or nothing. All right? And for some reason, I find a lot of young women who don't think that's true. But it is. You can read the amendment for yourself. Well, I could just go on and on, but I will stop. And thank you for being very patient. I would like to invite you to look at some of this stuff now that maybe it's a little more in context for you. I'm happy to answer questions and entertain comments, but you can roam around. You're free to go, whatever you would like to do. And thank you for having me.
You've been a very good sport about wearing that hat, and none of us would like you if you wanted to.
Get a hat pin. I know, it usually doesn't slide around quite as much. I don't know why. Oh, that's right, I got a haircut. I had longer hair, more hair. So, but anyway,
This did not require patience. It was wonderful.
oh, thank you. Like I say, I had to cut out a lot of stuff because the library is generous enough to get it. But there was just so much I wanted to tell you. But yes, Emerita.
Do you remember your first piece of memorabilia, what it was, when you saw it, and why you were drawn to it and start this whole
Wow.
collection?
I don't know that I remember my first piece. People ask me, I started collecting 50 years ago when nobody did, believe it or not. And now I really can't do much because museums collect, and I can't compete with museum prices. I mean, it's just, if you all knew what some of this goes for, you would just be shocked. And I did not pay that. But I will tell you that in the 70s, and part of the reason I collected is because I taught American literature and American studies and women's studies and that sort of thing. But my period of my PhD and so forth encompasses this period. And I taught classes in advanced rhetoric. And I was always interested, again, what makes people persuade other people to do things that they think maybe won't be in their best interest. And so I just got sort of interested in the language part of it, and I'm a feminist, and so it just kind of all rolled up. And my late husband used to have to work in Denver a lot, and I sometimes would go with him and get back in time to pick up my kids from school or whatever. And I would, Colfax used to have these really, really bad junk stores. I mean, just hole in the walls. And I would just go from store to store and ask, do you have, and I would say suffrage, and they wouldn't know what that meant, but anyway, and I would try to collect things. Okay, can I tell you one funny story? All right, so I was going from store to store, and people would say, well, you know, I had some stuff, but there was a woman in here just a few days ago, and she bought everything. And then I would go to the next, this woman just came in, and it just was over and over, and I was furious. But I also wanted to meet this woman. Who is this woman besides me who's collecting all this stuff? And again, this was 70s. And I said, do you know what her name was? And he said, well, no, not really. And then he went, one of the guys, and then he said, oh yeah, she gave me a check. Her name's on the check. Well, he shouldn't have told me, of course. I mean, you would do that now.
Yeah.
But he went and he got it. He went, oh yeah, her name was Pat Schroeder.
Ah.
Are you old enough to know? That's a great story. Okay. And I was like, well, dang, if I have to lose out to somebody, Pat Schroeder is, you know, the best person to.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I can just imagine what the anti-suffers were doing in Tennessee.
Uh-huh.
What were the suffers doing to try to woo?
Well, they were doing a lot of the same
Votes.
thing. It's just the antis had more liquor.
They had more money.
Yeah, it's, I think so. What do you think? I know Rosemary's read it and several other people have read the book, but they were doing the same thing. They were like lobbying. And I mean, it was just trying to appeal to their better angels and, you know, you know, like I said, you can look at some of the NAWSA appeals to, you know, your mother and your sister and your dog, you know, and all of this, of trying to convince them that this was the democratic right thing to do. You know, but no, if I've given the impression that Carrie Chapman Catt didn't just work her buns off every minute, that's the wrong impression, because she and the Suffs just worked and worked and worked and worked. But it wasn't maybe not as exciting as the parades and yeah, Rosemary, help me out here.
Was there something in there about trying to keep people, the voters, from actually being present to vote,
Oh yeah,
or making sure they came
Oh,
in
yeah.
their wagons to vote? You know, I think that was part of it too.
Exactly. And like I say, and some of the legislators tried to sneak out of town because they were like, you know, I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't, you know, here. But again, yeah, the shenanigans, that's why I use the word shenanigans. Really read this book. You will be so glad you did. It's called The Woman's Hour. It's in paperback. Yeah. So, yeah. Alan.
When all these women are being imprisoned, basically, what was the reaction of their husbands and their fathers and so forth?
Their
Do you think that there
family.
would be a men's outrage of what was happening to
Well,
these women?
People didn't know because they were not allowed to have visitors or letters.
Well, they knew
except for
their
these-
wives were gone for 2 months.
Well, they were supported. In fact, I have a proof of that. Oh, this is so funny. I'm not supposed to move. I went over here. It's okay. There was a New York parade. I put it here because again, I brought things I thought were kind of entertaining. And it was about a big parade in New York. And it's only about this long, this article, but part of it was, and they paraded by their husbands who were sitting in the bleachers, but these were supportive husbands. But I think whoever wrote this article just couldn't believe that there were men out there supporting these women. So yes, we had lots of men who were suffragists. I mean, who were supportive, but the majority were women because this was
Their issues.
but their issue, what they wanted. But Cherry, why do I keep saying Cherry? Carrie Chapman Catt, I wish she didn't have such a alliterative name, was a widow, and Alice Paul was not married. Oh, there are a couple of movies, if you all are into movies, about this whole period. One is called Iron Jawed Angels that came out years ago, and Angelica Houston, you know who that is, played Carrie Chapman Cat, and Hilary Swank is Alice Paul.
Oh,
Now,
I feel like, was there a documentary?
Iron-jawed angels. Now, it's a Hollywood movie, so don't swallow everything. They had to put a little romance in it, blah, blah, blah. But you want some entertainment? Watch it. And yes, thank you for mentioning that. There have been documentaries. One I would recommend is Burns, is
Ken Burns.
Thank you, Ken Burns.
Yeah.
And it's about some of the 19th century, and it is just excellent. And it is called, see, I even brought it, Not for Ourselves Alone. And it's by Jeffrey C. Ward and Ken Burns. And it is about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. It's about the early here. I recommend it highly. Really, really smart documentary. So, yeah.
Question I have is there a museum somewhere in the United States that gives us a history of women's suffrage?
Yes, and thank you for bringing that up because I wanted to mention a couple of things. First, yes, and I will. I don't want to keep the library people here. Okay, over here I have a thing. If you go to Washington, D.C., and you can get to Northern Virginia, it's Fairfax County, that has any meaning to you. The prison where the women were, they changed the name of it. It became the Lorton, because it's in Lorton, Virginia. Lorton Workhouse and Prison. Now it is an art center, but there is a really small, and I have a picture here, a really small part of the place, the old prison, that is a little dedicated to Lucy Burns. And it's really fun if you get there. Now, to your question, people have been trying to get a Smithsonian women's history Smithsonian for decades. They will take your money. They will take your donations because they are trying to get one that would be a complete. Whether we would get it in the next few years, I think is very doubtful. But they have been collecting donations for years. Where most of this stuff is now housed. I mean, states now, they have a lot of places, and you can go to buildings in Washington, D.C. that are famous suffrage buildings. But most of this stuff is at the National American History Museum in D.C. And I was gonna see how I have to point. For example, this is one of the rarest things I have. It's a journal called The Suffragist, and Alice Paul was the editor, and this is before she split with Carrie Chapman Catt, and it was a publication. And the only other one I've ever seen is in the National American History Museum. People just didn't keep things, especially paper things. I have some original over there, some original pins and so forth. But again, these things are so rare and so valuable. I only brought one reproduction. I have lots of reproduction things just to show. I only brought, everything else you see here is original. But I brought one reproduction over there that is a pin, that is a jail cell. Alice Paul, and she got the idea from Emmeline Pankhurst in England. It is a jail cell door, and she gave it to some of the women who had been locked up in the workhouse. These are so rare. I only know, again, of one in the National American History. This is considered, these pins, these few pins that she had created and made. These are the holy grail of suffrage collection. If any of you are ever cleaning out your grandmother's attic and you find one of these bins, call me immediately. But I brought it, you can buy a reproduction online. I mean, I think they're like $12 or $15 or something, but I brought it just so that you could see it because it's really fun. It's over there. Yeah, Fran.
That pin is described in Why They Marched, which is a book that we just, and the interesting thing about that book is that each chapter is about one of the people you usually don't hear about.
Exactly.
So it's a much more diverse. Don't let anybody know that I use that word.
I hear the sirens. No, and for a long time, you didn't hear much about Alice Paul. And now she's very, very popular. I did bring some modern things. I also like 25th anniversary, 50-year anniversary of the amendment. They will come out with because they have stamps. I collect everything. Stamps from the suffrage movement and so forth. And they'll come out with first day of issue. And some of from Seneca Falls, and they'll have the suffrage here. But there's so many women that I couldn't even begin to talk about that did so much. I mean, I think a lot of people have never heard of Lucy Burns, and she was arrested more than anybody else in the entire movement. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that there's a book called Small and the Mighty, which is about women who did great things that came out in the last year.
And there's one very in-depth chapter on Inez Mulholland.
Yes.
And she was an amazing person.
She totally was.
Yeah, so I couldn't figure out why I
Memorials.
knew it, because I just read the book this year, but.
And then her husband later married Edna St. Vincent Millay. If you know your book, American literature, sorry, anyway, that was that. Yes.
I do want to say that the League Book Club just read Why They Marched.
Yeah.
And the League Book Club is a great nonfiction book club, and one of them is on Zoom. And then they're also raising money to put the first suffragist monument ever in Washington on the Mall.
Yes.
They're making progress, but it's not happened yet.
And that's gone through a couple of incarnations. It started with a sculptor in Loveland.
That's what I was gonna ask.
And
Yes.
Jane Decker.
Jane Decker.
Yes.
But things happened. That was that's another story. Things happened, and it is not her statue that they are going to put on the mall. And I believe I'm correct in that Trump does not want it on the main mall.
What?
But
I had no idea that he would have wanted that. I think we should do one more question and then
let these nice people go home. But again, let me invite you to look at things, because I tried to bring things that I sort of talked about in my talk. If you want to see more, you have to come to my house.
Thank you so much.
Feel free to leave, to mingle, to look, to ask questions.